Hi everyone, welcome to the graphics programming virtual meetup. And we follow the Berlin Code of Conduct. We have Discord server. We have Twitter for our meeting announcements. And we have YouTube channel for the past meetings. Today's topic is this paper, Pyramidal Parametrics by Lance-Williams. It's a classic paper that first proposed mipmapping among several other things. So this is Lance-Williams, and if you have like a profile image on Wikipedia that looks like this, I would consider it is a success. And so the paper first started to talk about pyramidal data structures, which is a really general concept. So the paper said pyramidal data structures may be based on various subdivisions, binary trees, quad trees, org trees, or n-dimensional hierarchies. The common feature of those structures is a succession of levels which vary the resolution at which the data is represented. So the paper is not just about mipmapping. Instead, it is talking about some very general concept called pyramidal data structures that can be one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, or even higher dimension. And it doesn't say anything about how it gets subdivided and how it gets used. So it is a very general concept. But with this kind of data structure, we need some way to interpolate that. So the paper further said that parametric data structure needs to have intra and inter-level interpolation. And then the paper started to talk about the first example of this kind of parametric data structures, which is also where the novelty of this paper comes from, mipmapping. So the paper says mipmapping is a particular format for two-dimensional parametric functions, which along with its associated aliasing scheme has been used successfully to bandwidth texture mapping at New York Institute of Technology since 1979. So mipmapping is a technique to bandwidth texture mapping. Also, the acronym MIP is from the Latin phrase, I will not try to pronounce that, but it means many things in a small place. So good to know that MIP is not a word itself, but it's an acronym. But before we continue, I want to talk about aliasing and why the mipmapping is relevant. So aliasing happens when we undersampling high frequency signals. So for example, we have this very high frequency signal, and then we have a sample rate that is not high enough to capture all the information of that signal. And when we reconstruct the sample, we get something wrong. And that is basically the idea of aliasing. Unfortunately, when we do texture sampling, there will be a lot of aliasing happens. The reason is, let's say we have a box filter of this pixel, and we have 4 corners and the center. And we can map the 4 corners into the texture coordinates, and we can see the 4 corners are at 4 like random positions, and then we have this irregular shapes and of texels that it gets covered. So if we want to avoid aliasing, we need to integrate with this shape, which is clearly not practical. So instead, when doing texture sampling, we will probably just sample this one particular point, which is the sample point, the center point of the pixel. But again, since a lot of texels actually contributed to this area, but we also sampling this point, we have this undersampling problem, and that's why we have aliasing. So how mipmaps fit into this picture? Mipmapping supplements bilinear interpolation of pixel values in the texture map with interpolation between the pre-filtered version of the map. So we will talk about bilinear interpolation, how it helps to magnify the texture, but still it does not solve the problem of aliasing happen when we minify the texture. So we need, so Mipmap stores the pre-filtered images, and then we can use those pre-filtered images to solve the aliasing problem. So magnification happens when a single pixel mapped to a tiny area of the texture, and we can just use bilinear interpolation of texels to solve this problem. This is really easy, but on the other hand, since the textures clearly don't have enough information, we will have a blurry image as a result. So magnification is not ideal if we have a low resolution image. However, there are no choice. On the other hand, the minification is the result from a single pixel maps to a large area of texture, and it will result in horrible aliasing artifact. So the idea of texture prefiltering is that when we do minification, we have a single pixel on the screen cover many texels. For example, let's say we sample this center point, but actually this whole box contributes to a single pixel. Ideally, we can do super centering, but it is expensive. Also, in this image, everything is a box. But as we said before, in actually texture mapping, we will have irregular shapes, and it is even harder to actually super sample those kind of irregular shapes instead of boxes. So instead, we can store a set of pre-filtered images. For example, let's see if we pre-compute this area's value, and we store that single value, and then we can just fetch them. Then it becomes cheap. And that's how mipmapping comes from. Yeah, the Williams' original proposed mipmapping layout is kind of is like this. So we split this linear RGB array, two-dimensional array, into 4 quadrants, and the first quadrant we used it to store mipmap recursively, and the other 3 quadrants are used to store the RGB colors. So we have 3 channels, and then we just fit them recursively like here. A great advantage of this approach is if we want to, so this is level 0, level 1, level 2. If we want to get from the level 0's G value into level 1's G value, we only need to do one left shift, and we will get into here. And we can do a left shift again, and we get here. So it is very cheap to index into higher MIP levels. On the other hand, this approach, as ingenious as it is definitely not what modern hardware uses, because one, it only supports 3 components. It doesn't support more than 3 components. It is also not that cache friendly, at least with the modern CPU or GPU caches, and it only works with linear images, where last week we talked about images on the machine that not necessarily stored in the linear order. How to compute the Mipmap level? The paper gives this formula, which is so easy that everyone can just understand it by staring at it, which now it's definitely not the case. Definitely not the case for me. I stare at it and I say, oh, it's a partial of ux, vx, uy, vy, and then I don't know what's going on. So let's have a visual, let's see a visual representation of what is going on here. So let's say we have a bunch of pixels that we want to sample for textures. When we match those pixels into the texture coordinates, we can see that those blue grid map into this smaller area, and those red grid map to a larger area, which means that we want a lower MIP level for this green area and a higher MIP level for this red area, because we don't want to sample a large area. But and what we want to do is to just have a higher MIP level, kind of cut the image by half, and then our sample area will become smaller and the aliasing effect get reduced. So to do that, we need to calculate the MIP level. So the paper used partial, but I will use the delta here since it's a discrete space now, and we can see that delta u delta x is the UV coordinate at this pixel minus this pixel, and delta u delta y is the u coordinates of this pixel minus this pixel, and so on and so on. After we have those delta calculated, which is kind of the change, which we can understand them as the change rate of the u and v corresponding to the x and y. Then we can calculate two additional numbers, Lx and Ly, which is which distance between the samples on the textual coordinates at x and at y, and as we can see here, the Lx is just the UV coordinates change according to x, but then we need to square those two deltas, and then just square root the whole result. Also, I should probably add additional parentheses around this. And yeah, similarly for y, it's the same. And then we calculate the max of Lx and Ly because we can only have one MIP level for, and we can't have like different MIP level for X and Y. So we need just use the max of Lx and Ly. And then at last use the log base 2 to get the actual MIP level. Now, how to actually using this MIP map? The one way to use the MIP map is to just clamp the depth value d into the nearest d. This approach, and then do into a nearest integer level, and then we can just use bilinear filtering to get the actual value and get a sample on that MIP level. But bilinear filtering requires 4 taxol read and 3 lerps. However, one is that we will have a jump between different MIP levels, and that can cause some artifact. So instead, another approach is proposed by the paper is to use trilinear filtering, where we first have bilinear filtering across different MIP levels. So we have level +1, d+1, and level d. We will filter both those levels to get 2 values, and then we will do a lerp again using our floating point d, which is between this level d and d+1, to get our final value. So notice that the resolution of different MIP level is different, doesn't matter, because we always just sample 4 points on each MIP level. What is a problem with this approach? The paper recognized the problem. The most severe compromise made by MIP filtering is that it is symmetrical. So each of the pre-filtered level of the map is filtered equally in X and Y. We already seen that before, where we calculate the MIP level, we use the max of X and Y, which means that we just always use the higher MIP level that we calculated from X and Y coordinates. And if it is too high, then we will have some kind of blurry. Unfortunately, if we have some really oblique angles, so at this kind of greasy angles, texture samples will be stretched out by a very different amount of U and V across X and Y. And as a result, with our trilinear filtering, where we use this max approach, then we get really blurry at the end. Of course, if we use min, then we will be good at here, but we will have aliasing artifact at here. So trilinear filtering is not enough to solve this problem. And the paper recognized the problem, but didn't have a solution. But this problem can be solved by anisotropic mapping, anisotropic filtering. Sorry, and it solves this problem by have anisotropically downsampled images in addition to each MIP levels. And it is way more expensive. That's why there are dedicated hardware to do this. And maybe someday we can also talk about anisotropic filtering in this group. And that's all for Mipmapping in this paper. And the paper then start talk about highlight anti-aliasing, which I think is quite outdated. So I don't talk too much about it in this presentation. The idea is to have some kind of illumination map, and then we use the same approach of the Mipmap on them. And then this way we can have less of a normal jump across different pixels when we do rendering. The paper talks a lot about alternative approach like integrating to areas which don't work for triangle meshes, but it uses like more of analytic geometries where you know exactly the curvature at each point, and then you can do this kind of integration. And of course, it doesn't work as well as this mipmapping approach, and it's very expensive. At the end, the paper also talk about level of details in surface representation. The basic idea is we can just recursively prefilter this mesh to create lower and lower resolution mesh, and then we have a level of detail. And this, yeah. So that's it. Any questions?
There was one at the very beginning by Omar that you could look for.
Oh, yeah, 9 chunk.
Yeah, I can just kind of look like I was just kind of wondering. I think you maybe addressed it. I guess this paper introduced mipmapping, but he was talking about how it was implemented before, like the New York lab. But it sounds like he was just talking about work that he was involved in. Like this is the first time. This is the first paper that talks about mipmapping, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, it talks about a more general, like parametric data structure concepts, but I think mipmapping is the main contribution of this paper. How does modern hardware do it? Is there a standard common way? If you mean how the mipmap layout is under modern hardware, I can only say I don't know. That's something like just API call. So I don't really know what.
There isn't exactly a standard or a specified layout.
Yeah.
They usually use the Hilbert curve or Z curve because it makes accessing nearby pixels very cache friendly over a linear mapping where the rows are very coherent, but the columns are very incoherent. So the Z curve lessens that cost.
Do they do that with the different levels of the mipmaps? Like, are there different levels interwoven with?
I doubt it.
So it's just like, so it'd be like each level is separately stored in the like Hilbert curve way.
Well, to be frank, this is hardware specific implementation.
Right.
Do they do that? Maybe. I don't know. It's just called optimal in various formats. It's the optimal layout for whatever the hardware likes best. Some hardware is very open about what that is, and other is like, I'm not going to tell anyone.
Yeah, I guess you wouldn't necessarily want to like interweave the maps because that implies that you're going to be like always sampling between layers, but I guess that's not always the case.
You always need to sample between two layers.
Oh yeah?
At least if it's trilinear or like anisotropic approach, you always need to sample between two layers and interpolate them.
Right, okay. Yeah, so maybe they are interwoven then. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I think they're definitely stored together, but I don't know if it's this format anymore. Yeah, it's definitely not this format, but more, I think it's more like one level at here and another level at here and another level at here, something like that.
Toshi is asking the storage requirements. It's basically the size of the image plus a quarter the size of the image plus an eighth, 16th?
They are in this storage
plus
layout.
60.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in most mipmapping schemes, that's how much memory we'll use.
In most mipmapping schemes, it's really cheap. It's definitely less than 2x of the original image.
Yeah, I think it's 1 point. I think it's actually the what's it called curve, the golden circle. It's like square root of 2. It's 1.5 or less memory. So 50% more memory to store all the mipmaps that you could possibly want, and you know.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Is that true even if you have alpha? Like if you have 4 channels?
If you have 4 channels, you just have 4 channels, and you add all the channels out. You add alpha to all the pixels.
Yeah.
Well,
this thing will totally break
right,
with 4 channels, but like the general ideas still hold.
Right, that's true. The storage requirement doesn't change.
Yeah.
If you want to hear something fun that you can do with mipmaps, back when I used to play Team Fortress 2, I mean, there was the option to make your own sprays. So people would use the mip levels, like to make it so that the spray changes as you get closer and farther from it.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it'd be like a hot girl, like from the from the distance, and then you get closer, and it turns into a meme.
That's really awesome.
Okay.
So you can do some pretty neat stuff by exploiting the like the core principle of how this operates. Like, while you don't have to store like lower res versions of your texture, like you can store like other stuff in different mip levels.
Interesting.
That's actually interesting because it reminds me of something, I guess, a practical use of storing different stuff. In WebGL, when we were implementing image-based lighting, basically because WebGL 1 doesn't support cube maps, so we needed a way to kind of pack that. And so one way is to pack, like you have a version of the environment map for like metallic textures and one for like rougher textures and like a bunch of stuff in between. We would store them as MIP levels. So if you depending on the roughness or metallic factor of the material, you would sample the right MIP level, and because you want to interplay between those, and it would just interpolate, and it all just worked. There's actually a paper on it, and that was pretty fun.
Cool.
That's neat.
There is known uses of this, using mipmaps for things other than the downsampled image, and a lot of GameCube games apparently did that. So they'll have certain effects where it will fade based on the distance because it's storing a visibly distinct mipmap. So they did something where like the surface of water or lava, one of the I think it was Wind Waker. This forum post may describe it, but
they also did it in Mario Sunshine.
Yes, yeah, where like the water has a reflectance. So at some angle, it's pretty reflective, but because you're almost always on the ground, they made it so that at a certain MIP level has that reflectance built into it. So you get this nice shiny off of it, and then you get up close to the water and look down, and it's nice and smooth.
That's really neat.
And, you know, it's just, I think it's always cool that, you know, like when you find that, like these like little like, you know, like alternative like use cases for, you know, for a technique that the original authors like never thought of.
Technically abuse, but yeah, really interesting what people do. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to start recording now?
Sure.